Should you read The Wheel of Time? Written by Robert Jordan, The Wheel of Time is a huge epic fantasy consisting of 14 books plus a prequel novel, totaling over 4 million words, 704 chapters, and over 2,700 characters. It's a lot to commit to, and as a channel covering Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, the question about whether or not to read The Wheel of Time is a question I've received a lot, considering that Brandon Sanderson himself completed the series by writing the final 3 books after Robert Jordan unfortunately passed away. So today, I want to answer whether or not The Wheel of Time is still worth reading, especially for those of you who are already fans of Brandon Sanderson. Now, let me give you some context around my experience with The Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time is the fantasy series I grew up with and read as a teenager, and is what ultimately led me to love the genre. The main pillars of my reading life, as you will, sort of went from Animorphs to Harry Potter to The Wheel of Time and ultimately to the Cosmere, which I've been reading now for over 20 years. Man, that makes me feel very old. But The Wheel of Time was really the first truly epic fantasy I read, and there are tons of similarities to The Wheel of Time and the Cosmere, which makes a lot of sense because Brandon himself was also a huge fan of The Wheel of Time. In fact, you may not know this, but at signings, Robert Jordan was really one of the first to answer questions from the audience like Brandon continues today with his Words of Brandon. And back then, there wasn't really video online of Jordan answering these questions, so it was just sort of shared as best as possible throughout the community to try to learn as much about this world as possible. And even the term RAFO, which means read and find out, that was something Robert Jordan came up with and used quite often when answering questions. I was actually really fortunate to be at one of Robert Jordan's last signings during the release tour of the final book he ended up writing called Knife of Dreams, and it was just really cool to be a part of that. Now, as a teenager and young adult, I read through all of the books except for one, the final book that concluded the series, A Memory of Light. I think for me, I was just so attached to these characters that for some reason, I just didn't want to see it end. And it wasn't really until over a decade later that I decided to read the final book. But obviously the details of all the other books were a little fuzzy at that point, so I ended up rereading the entire series. And while I can say that reading The Wheel of Time was absolutely worth it for me, that doesn't necessarily mean that I recommend it. There's certainly both pros and cons, and I want to address those as best as I can in this video to help anyone thinking about reading this massive series some information and additional opinions that may help. So first, I want to talk about the world building, because that is easily the #1 reason for me that I love The Wheel of Time and why I will eventually get to a third reading. The world Robert Jordan built is amazing. It's huge and diverse, and it sort of reminds me of the size and scope of Roshar from the Stormlight Archive. If you want to dig into a world that is very thoroughly realized, interconnected, with interesting differences in cultures and even species, The Wheel of Time is fantastic. There's also a deep and interesting magic system here, one that is very unique, that plays off gender dynamics, which are central to the book's themes. But if you are looking for a magic system as well developed and rule-based as those in the Cosmere, The Wheel of Time is quite a bit softer. It's not that there are no rules, as there are a lot that are established, it's just that they aren't quite as clear, and often one person will just be able to do things no one else can do because they are stronger with the one power than others. Not a huge negative necessarily, but something I think you should know about before jumping into this. The writing style and pacing, though, is quite a bit different from the Cosmere. Robert Jordan likes to be a bit more flowery with his writing and is a bit more detailed when he describes, well, everything, from someone's clothes to the rug they are standing on. And while sometimes I found this to be great and really interesting alongside the world building, at other times, it can make the writing feel overly bogged down and slow. It's also one of the things I found gets worse as the series went on, until Brandon picked it up and used more of his own writing style to complete the final 3 books. The pacing and structure of the books is also quite different. Fans of Sanderson will know of what I refer to as the Sanderlanche, where everything in the book in the final third or so just starts clicking together and bubbling to create this epic series of events that sucks you in and makes every book finish with a bang. Jordan does this a bit, but not nearly as effectively, and often it's sort of just like a final chapter that sort of does this. But again, as the books continue, he actually becomes less effective at this over time. and still having to do with pacing, which is one of the biggest negatives, at least for me, with the Wheel of Time, is that as the story goes on, the world gets bigger, more characters get introduced, and the plot becomes slower and slower. And honestly, by the 10th book, it can be a struggle to get through. It does pick up a little bit in book 11, and then Sanderson again does a great job of tightly wrapping things up, but you are being asked to read a lot of pages that don't amount to much in plot development. Like if I took the entirety of the Wheel of Time, which again consists of 14 main books, I believe there is way more plot development happening in the first 5 books of the Stormlight Archive than all of the 14 books of the Wheel of Time. So you just have to know it's going to be a slower paced journey. And for me, the part I struggle the most with in terms of suggesting the Wheel of Time, it isn't the pacing, it's actually the characters. And while I love some of the main characters, especially Rand and Matt, many of the others I really don't have a ton of fun reading about. Especially, unfortunately, many of the women characters have absolutely some of the most annoying personalities possible. And look, I love most of the Cosmere female characters. Vin, Shallan, Yasna, Navani, Lift. I absolutely adore Sanderson's female characters, so don't get after me in the comments when I say that some of the Wheel of Time females can be annoying as hell, with some of the worst personality traits you could imagine. So if lovable characters are a big reason you love reading fantasy, just be cautious with this series and maybe read the first book to get a better sense of things. But unfortunately, the characters actually get more unbearable as the series goes on. So even after the first few books, it might seem fine, but eventually you may struggle to read through some chapters that are focused on specific characters, especially when, like I said, there can be times when the plot seems to be going at a snail's pace. That said, the series does wrap up fantastically. The way Sanderson was able to turn the Wheel of Time around and finish with 3 epic books and a final book that may be one of the best finales to any epic fantasy series. I mean, to me, this is probably still one of the most impressive things Sanderson has ever done. It's almost unbelievable that he was able to take over from Jordan and write these as quickly and as well as he did. It's truly an astounding achievement. The other thing I consider when people ask me if they should read The Wheel of Time is, back when these books were being released, there was less great options than there are now. We are truly living in the golden age of fantasy. Like, there are so many amazing series that I would probably suggest way more than The Wheel of Time. And so while I do love this series and I do suggest people read it if they are still interested after knowing some of the pros and cons, I think I would only suggest it if you've already read a ton of fantasy series already, because I don't think it would even be in the top 10 series at this point for me in terms of what I'd suggest. Of course, that's just my opinion. I would love to know what you think in the comments. I'm sure that some of you, if not many of you, will disagree with me, and that's great. So definitely share your perspective so others can read your thoughts as well. As always, thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.